Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Zoe in Beijing. Recently, China's Central Inspection Panel made the judgment the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, one of the four largest banks in China, has seriously nepotism problems. Earlier this year, China's central authority decided to expand a pilot anti-corruption program to end nepotism and regulate the behavior of those executives' family members. So what are the reasons behind the persistence of this problem inside China's state-owned enterprises, and how does it affect the enterprises and their performance and harm the public interest? And what lessons can China learn from the rest of the world in rooting out this difficult problem? To talk about these and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Senior Fellow of the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies, Renmin University of China, and Professor Liu Baocheng of the University of International Business and Economics. But before we get started, let's take a look at this.
China's Central Inspection Panel recently announced that the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, ICBC, one of China's four major state-owned banks, has serious nepotism problems. Among the 691 senior officials working directly with the ICBC's headquarters, 220 have either spouses or children who work in the same bank. The Central Inspection Team demanded that ICBC complete a self-examination of nepotism before the end of May. And this is not the only case. Following investigation, China Taiping Insurance Group, China Life Insurance, Agricultural Development Bank of China, and another 3 companies are also involved in the scandal. Nepotism, or cronyism, is a form of corruption that has long been a prevalent phenomenon in China. It leads to unfairness in a broad sense, and identifying each individual case will be difficult. In the past, employers have sometimes attempted to address the problem, but their efforts often fail because the chain of interest is too solid to be broken. In late 2012, President Xi Jinping launched the current anti-corruption campaign, and fighting corruption is now one of the 3 pillars of his domestic strategy.
So we're talking about nepotism inside state-owned enterprises here in China. This is a single case, ICBC, one of the 4 major industrial banks in China, but 1/3 of its executives working inside the banks are related. That's something that's quite extraordinary. But is it the discipline program a problem, or is it a management problem?
Well, I think we need to clarify what is nepotism. The definition is very important. For example, if you simply have friends and relatives to work for your organization, that's not really nepotism per se. Nepotism is there to involve partiality and favoritism, so in the entire process. So there is undue influence involved. So it is not a standalone conception. So that's number one. And well, as to your question, this is really a rampant issue. So I think now, before we really point fingers into this problem, we need to really understand what is the Chinese history in the state-owned firms. So, for example, you know, we used to run under the planned economy, run small society, small community within one organization, and also that was considered to be a devotion to have more family members to work for one organization. You know, we had a famous slogan in the for the oil.
You are saying this is a legacy from the past.
That's right, from oil field workers. You know, I devote my youth to oil production, and then I donate my children to the same line of business. So I think there is, well, of course, culturally there's a long legacy of Confucianism in the clan culture, but there's also the legacy of the planned economy.
John, do you think we can define this as nepotism? 1/3 of banks' staff are related or friends?
Well, I don't really want to comment on an individual case in China because it sort of becomes interference in China's internal affairs, which I don't want to do.
But as
a general question, there is no evidence that there is inheritance of business skill or scientific skill or anything. The descendants of Newton or Darwin or Einstein, I don't think if Einstein had children, but there's no evidence that great leaders have great children. Therefore, this leads to inefficient allocation of assets. I personally have got a rather radical position. I support the position of Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, who said they will leave their children $10 million each, and that's it. and the rest of the money would be transferred to somebody else because there's no evidence that the children run it better than other people.
But in this case, it seems that those family members or friends that work in a large bank, they have issues of conflict of interest if there is a management problem prop up.
Yes, certainly. This is the real question, but it will affect people's influence. People are not divided into, you know, their business selves and their personal things. I think it is a healthy situation if you have a significant number of people who are related to each other, working in the same organisation in principle. I have very definite views on the question of running of state and indeed private enterprises, which is I'm in favour of having high salaries and maximum transparency. I don't think that a state enterprise in any country is a sort of charity in which what you're supposed to do is give your labour and so on and so forth.
It's not necessarily a charity thing. This is a corporate culture thing for many of the state-owned enterprises, isn't it, Mr. Liu?
Yes, I think it is really the institutional setting and also the corporate culture that is at play. And we have to remember that corporate culture is highly related to the social culture and based on accumulation basis. I want to take the opportunity to clarify another concept, that is the difference between nepotism and cronyism. So actually the nepotism, you know, it's related directly to blood connection, but cronyism is more of a pervasive and rampant issue that is going on in China. So if you ask any foreigner who knows little about China, they know the word guanxi. So the guanxi turns out to be a spider web, both socially and institutionally, that reciprocation of favors is really the mainstay for maintaining the type of guanxiology. So, you know, this is really penetrating into organizational structure.
But do you think it is rampant in China's state-owned enterprises system, or
I think anywhere. It's not only in the business circle, but also in the political circle. We have so many, you know, sparklings of the previous leaders sitting in the position. But what my position is that, okay, qualification and merit is the only criteria. So if you simply say, okay, because you have a blood connection, you're not allowed to enter this organization. That's really
how did it come into being? Why the human resources departments in different SOEs cannot practice a merit-based application and recruitment system?
So I think one is the transparency of the selection criteria. And the other is disclosure, voluntary disclosure from both the employee and also those who really provide reference. And third is the ongoing dynamism to check and supervise even after the hire process. So you know, this is made known and made public. So this way we are able to really provide a more transparent and equitable standard for all people. So because if we, like the Shandong rule, if we just simply deny all the family members to participating, that really creates a sort of unfair situation on the part of those blood connections of those people.
Do we have similar problems in the West?
Yes,
if there is a state-owned enterprise,
of course you do. How do they? Even worse in private enterprises.
Because there was a Singapore Temasek pattern. They also have state-owned enterprises. How do they recruit new people? How do they avoid this kind of guanxi network from taking over the management?
Well, you have the problem, but the problem is even more extreme in the private sector, to be frank, than it is in the
so
in the
not necessarily the ownership.
No, it's not. It's nothing to do.
It's
nothing to do with ownership. In fact, there's some more transparency. I mean, I am an enormous admirer of the Singapore system. The Singapore system, you are paid a very high salary, which incidentally creates big incentive for people to compete for the job. One of the reasons is you really want this job, so you're going to be looking out for people, and you have absolute transparency. Everything you own, your relatives, etc., is all public. I was involved in something when I was in London running things. We hired the former head of the New York Transit Authority to run the London transport system. His salary was $2 million a year. I think he was saved a huge amount of money. It was probably the best buy we ever.
So he
got
will
in that
keep
whole
his
period.
integrity because of his high payment.
He had very high payment. He didn't need to take any money on the side. He didn't need to favour anybody, and he had a huge incentive to keep the job. And other people who wanted promoted had a huge job because we had to pay. Nobody was paid.
So
as much
even
as him.
he employs his friend or relatives, that does not necessarily mean it's nepotism because it's still a merit basis.
No, but he didn't, and it doesn't happen that way because you get very intense competition for the jobs, because the rewards are transparent. They're not gained by having some secondary reward in the staying at good hotels or being able to employ somebody. Your reward comes that you get a very big pay package, and
So
that's how it operates.
Here in China is quite interesting because the incentives mechanism seems to be totally different. Now we are cutting down dramatically the payment of SOE executives here in China. We want them to be clean, but we want them to get paid less. How would that work?
Well, the incentive can be divided into intangibles and tangibles. Actually, to be in the position of in an SOE leader, you really have a strong influence because you still have a strong power economically and even politically. So therefore, nepotism cannot really be prevented from the abuse of the power. So the the alternative arrangement is one solution that they are given a choice as how to pick the merit-based one and with all the clear rules and criteria set forth, and merely by reducing the salary, but without alternative arrangement, without of their power. So the root cause is still there.
Is there any cultural undertone here? Because in Chinese tradition, 举贤不避亲, you can award a position to somebody who is your relatives, although he's related to you, because this is our tradition, and you want to employ somebody who you can trust in China. Does it have any?
Well, Confucius said directly, if you do not care people around you, you are not a gentleman. So therefore, the 裙带关系, the belt and the skirtish around you. So, and also China has a very strong root culture. You can see that how many people go to their villages, during the Spring Festival. It's not only to meet their parents, but also to meet their, hometown fellows, etc. So this is really
because
a good
trust
value.
is very important.
Right.
You can trust a cohort of people that is related to you and put faith in you.
That's right. When social infrastructure is not complete, people need to weave a spider web for mutual assistance. Someone is having a daughter married without sufficient fund. You depend on the the gift giving from all the entire friend circle, and this has a multiplying effect because you feel the sense of gratitude, and you need to pay one way or the other. So. If you are sitting in a sort of advantageous position, there is a likely a temptation for you to use your power to really satisfy the relationship equation.
Does it make any sense to you, John, to have a web of guanxi so that you can have better, efficient management?
Well, there is a specific element. I am very far from being an expert on Confucius. However, I was rather surprised with his statements about family connections, which is a different tradition to the West, a different culture. That's not.
But do you think it can work?
No, I'm not. I don't want to comment on it very much. As I say, I'm not an expert on Confucius, but I found it very, very striking and markedly different to a Western conception that it should be said so explicitly. No, I believe fundamentally monetary. I'm in favour of great transparency. I'm in favour of high pay. I am a great admirer of China's economic policy. I've written a huge amount about it. I do not agree with its views on the payment of high state officials.
But still, China's state-owned enterprises need to reform in many different aspects. We'll talk about how China's state-owned enterprises got to be reformed, in which direction later on in this broadcast. You're now watching Dialogue. Don't go away. We'll be right back. We are talking about nepotism and China's state-owned enterprises. We understand that China is undergoing a huge plan to reform its state-owned sector. Which direction are we heading, and what kind of reforms we're looking at? Will it eradicate nepotism because of the reforms?
Well, I do not really buy in the concept of abruption. Like the Shandong case, to simply stop, simply because, well, there's going to be a potential for nepotism to simply stop the relatives to get into a certain, they need really to have a more clear and precise and transparent rules to prevent favoritism. So that's the core issue. And
what about introducing market mechanism into personnel recruitment? For example, we hire more professional managers as the management team of these state-owned enterprises rather than handpicked by the state asset supervision organ?
But still, as long as the culture is there, as long as the power is there, so this is inevitable. So therefore, a fundamental solution is to minimize or marginalize the importance of power within the state-owned enterprise. So
how are we going to do that? How are we going to overhaul?
Well, we invite more of the private capital into it, and also to have the sort of a sizable share, which permits the sort of voice of the private enterprise and the market to say. So that's one thing really to check and balance the excessive use of the power. The other is really to reduce the area where it is not necessary for the SOEs to monopolize. So
you mean expose them to more competition?
That's right. And then you may really rely on a third party to select people, and the constant mechanism to supervise the sort of partiality that might be used for the entire process is not only at the gate, but rather in the entire process and outcome. So whether the undue influence is really detectable.
How do you think of this, John? We introduce mixed ownership into state-owned enterprises. We have third party to recruit people, and we expose them to more competition.
I think it depends upon what is the fundamental thing, what is the competitive structure of the industry. Some industries are just inherently monopolies. There's nothing you can do about it. You can't build a second electricity
We should have
grid.
more or less of this.
No, but it's more or less. It's determined by the amount of capital investment that's required. Nobody can build a second electricity grid. Nobody can build a second metro system. Nobody can build a second railway. It's too expensive. Therefore, these.
So you're saying the current structure is wholesome?
No, it depends on what the structure is. If where you have something which cannot be anything but a monopoly, I'm in favour of the state owning it, for the simple reason that the experience of 150 years of trying to control private monopolies shows that it can't be done. Once you do that,
what is your suggestion? What sectors?
Well, then you have to. Well, these are things like railways, electricity supply, metro systems, urban transport systems.
What about telecommunications and financial services?
Well, there's two different parts of telecommunications.
Energy.
Telecommunications, it depends what you're doing. The actual, what you might call the fibre, the hardware, that's inherent in monopoly. It's perfectly possible to have different suppliers using the same system over the same hardware, so to speak, right? There, I'm in favour of the state owning it and the state having very direct command of the situation and being able to remove people very easily. To have is the management to have security of tenure in that situation. That's why I'm in favour of the system. They're very highly paid and they can be removed essentially at 24 hours notice.
Okay.
And that combination gives you a very strong incentive to be efficient. Other sectors, the state should just keep out of. The ones which are what economists technically perfect competition, which are merely competitive. Nobody wants state-owned restaurant, retail sectors, things like this. These are just they're competitive. The state should stay away.
Do you
from
totally agree, Mr. Liu? Those are the areas, actually a lot of areas that the state-owned capital have been drawing back from.
That's right. I think we need to identify what is really the key pillar to the national security and national economic stability.
What is your definition? The upstream industries.
Right, from the upstream industries. For example, for the oil exploration and refinery, it can be a pillar, but in the meantime, the gas station may not be, and also the sales of oil and the service may not be. So whether we are able to spin off certain of the peripheral type of service, so that's we are able to draw a border. And the other is that how we really can shift in a sort of market base, to cut the tie from the state intervention. So that's an issue.
You mean intervention in personnel arrangement or in capital access?
Well, certain undue influence. So if you are, a government official, for example, from Sussex, my direct boss in the government. So how do I respond to certain subtle signals that you sent to me? You have a nephew, you have a daughter. So to prevent the excessive power influence from the government into market-driven decisions. So that's a very important message that we need to send.
But how does it work? Will we have a board like this, or we have another third party, as you said, agency who do that?
Well, number one, we need to shape out a culture. We are now shifting from a village's culture where, friends and relatives can, cook together, but into more of a stranger's culture. And so each individuality needs to be exercised in decision making. And the other, yes, we need to set up an open and transparent mechanism, and leave it not only to the disciplinary committee to probe into the issue, but put it under the sunshine that every citizen can really whistleblow, can really pick on, can raise questions and issues, so that they can really be able to defend that no excessive power, no undue influence was there in this election and evaluation process.
Another big problem facing the state-owned enterprises this year is, of course, the reduction of overcapacity. Many of those upstream industries like mine, coal, steel, they have been facing tremendous pressure because of the slowing down of the economy. Can they handle both better efficiency with the management and declining demand and reduction of capacity?
This is the question: what sort of social safety net the state puts in place. As long as you don't have a proper social security system in China, effective one, it's going to be very hard to lay off people. Because firstly...
But we're talking about probably millions.
Yeah, but you see, this is the problem. In my opinion, it won't happen, to be very frank, because there's not a social security system that's in place. In the West, if you become unemployed, you have welfare benefits, you have social benefits.
They do
have
have unemployment benefits, but not good enough.
No, not good enough.
They need to have jobs.
Yes. But in the West, what you have is you have a sufficient social security net that when you're unemployed, certainly your standard of living goes down. But the assumption is that you will then move into another job within a relatively reasonable period of time, not next week, but we might say, a year to 2 years. And meanwhile, your standard of living does not collapse. As long as you do not have an adequate social security net, which does not exist in China, to be frank, you will not be able to lay off enormous numbers of people without, one, impossible human problems, and secondly, without serious social discontent. If you put people into
another thing that is on the mind of the decision makers.
If you put people in desperate social situations,
social unrest, because the size of the problem, we're talking about millions, if not tens of millions of people get laid off.
I think more fundamentally is that we need to discover what is the root cause for the zombie enterprises. So very often it is not really the macro management issue, it is really the state planning issue. So namely the Chinese national economic planners, they messed up in their planning, so they didn't really forecast correctly what is there going to be. So if we use the same power to nullify the same power, we often say that the doctors cannot cure their own diseases. So how to prevent the repetition of the same type of decision-making error? So I think that's something we need to take care of. The other is really the special budget for training. So these people, they are innocent, and many of them have been role models, in working very hard, but they just stepped into the wrong management or wrong business. So how really, we can be, the government and the society can be responsible to provide funds for them to have new skills and to get fitted into new job positions. So I think that's undeniable.
But all these will be very costly, especially to the local government. The local government have to make budgets to train those programs. They have to take the pressure if they don't have jobs and roam around the streets. Do you think the local government's up to the task?
Well, they have to realize further delay means a higher cost. So it's their people, and so local government will, particularly for the state-owned firms, they have to work with also the central government, with the firm, and with the, industry, associations per se, to work out a scheme to better place these people. So I think the key is that, social welfare and also job training or on-job training, and so. The previous way of doing that is that, okay, I give you a lump sum deal and you just go away, I'm no longer responsible. So this is not really applicable in today's situation.
That's basically what happened in 1996.
That's right. That was a sort of one-time buy-off. So that was really not a responsible approach.
It won't work this time with this kind of management. No. What do you think is the ideal position for state-owned enterprises in China going down the road with a much shrunken size of the state-owned enterprises in China's economy?
No, I think it depends upon the sector, as I said. I think you will get no end of problem if you try to privatize monopolies. You'll just get a total
But many
mess.
people will get out of this economy.
But you see, there's three different types of sector from actor. There's perfectly competitive. The state should just stay out. Or it's supply infrastructure and very important things like that. But it shouldn't be right. Secondly, there is no branch of economic theory analysis which tells you in some competitive industries whether a state company or a private company is going to be effective. These are industries which are necessarily dominated by 2 or 3 very large companies, right?
Monopoly.
No, not monopoly. Monopoly is totally different. Monopoly, there is only one. Technically, it's called oligopoly, but it means competition between two or three very large companies, right? There, in my opinion, private companies and state sector companies should just be allowed to compete, and we will find out which is more efficient. Each has some advantages. The state has advantages. It doesn't have to pay dividends, which means it's cheaper. It can borrow more cheaply because it's defended by the state. On the other hand, it doesn't have the element of personal incentive in it, of ownership, and so both types of industry have advantages. Let them compete with each other.
All right, we're running out of time. Thank you very much, John. Thank you, Mr. Liu. And you've been watching Dialogue here on CCTV News. I'm Joe in Beijing. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.